He bent down gently, his hand brushing over the colorful book cover as he asked, "What about this one, buddy?" The little boy beside him, with curls the color of chestnuts and cheeks still round with childhood, beamed up at him. "I like the one with the rocket, Dad." That word dad was warm, healing, and loud enough to catch the attention of a stranger standing just 3 aisles over. Elliot Sanders never expected a quiet Saturday afternoon to unravel so viciously. He had spent the last 2 weeks adjusting to a new reality, caring for Micah, the 6-year-old boy he and his late husband, Alex, had waited almost a year to foster. After Alex died in a car accident just a few months before the adoption could be finalized, Elliot fought through layers of bureaucracy and grief to secure temporary guardianship. It was all still so fresh. Every bedtime story, every shoe tied, every whisper of dad still carried a mix of joy and mourning. They were at a children's toy and bookstore tucked inside the busiest mall in Fort Collins, Colorado. Elliot, 35, an elementary art teacher known for his kindness and patience, had brought Micah to pick out a book and a small toy for the weekend. He wore a lightweight jacket one he'd worn countless times before, with a discreet rainbow pin near the collar. To him, it was simply part of who he was, a quiet badge of love, resilience, and memory. But for Karen Whitaker, standing at the end of the aisle, that pin might as well have been a warning label. She was in her early 60s, sharply dressed and loud without raising her voice. When she turned the corner and saw Elliot crouched beside Micah, hand on the boy's shoulder, she didn't see a father and son. She saw something else entirely, something shaped by ignorance, prejudice, and fear. In one abrupt motion, she lunged forward, pulling Micah back by the arm and shouting, "Get away from him! Don't touch that child!" The store fell silent. Every head turned, every phone lit up. Screens pointed at Elliot as if he were a museum exhibit titled Suspect. Micah began to cry, confused and terrified, as Karen gripped his wrist tighter and stood between them like a self-appointed guardian angel. "I saw him," Karen declared. "He was trying to take the boy. Someone like that doesn't belong near children. Look at him." Her voice was sharp, accusing, slicing through the store like glass. Elliot stood frozen. The blood drained from his face as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His body, once steady and confident, trembled under the weight of 100 judging eyes. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet, fumbling for the documents that proved he wasn't a stranger. Not a threat, but a father, a grieving, exhausted, determined father. But no one asked to see them. Not yet. Instead, all they saw was what they wanted to see. A man who didn't look the way a father should. A man who was different, alone and therefore in their minds. Guilty. Micah reached out, tears streaking down his cheeks. "Dad, he sobbed, but Karen pulled him closer, whispering something under her breath about calling the police. Her phone was already in her hand. Elliot stepped back, his heart pounded, not from fear of being caught, but from the crushing realization that they didn't care. Not about the documents, not about the truth, not even about Micah's cries. They saw a rainbow pin, and that was enough. He stood there, surrounded by whispers, as the world narrowed into a blur of assumptions and cruelty. And he knew, in that moment, that surviving this day wasn't just about proving he belonged. It was about protecting the little boy who already believed he did. Have you ever seen someone wrongly accused and stood silent? Or did you speak up? If Elliot's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful LGBTQ+ stories of love, truth, and resilience. The air inside the store had turned cold, though the heating hadn't changed. It wasn't the temperature, it was the weight of judgment, thick and unrelenting, settling onto Elliot's skin like smoke he couldn't escape. Karen Whitaker's voice didn't waver. She stood tall, gripping Micah's wrist in one hand and her phone in the other. Her eyes scanned Elliot from head to toe, narrowing as they landed on his jacket. The small rainbow pin, once just a quiet tribute, now seemed to scream in her mind. A symbol not of love, but of something dangerous, something corrupt. Her words spilled out as if she'd rehearsed them. This man doesn't look like a real parent. Look at him. Skinny. Earrings. That pin. A normal man doesn't take a child shopping alone. Not one dress like that. Micah whimpered, confused, reaching again for Elliot. Dad. But Karen turned to the small crowd that had formed around them. You heard that he's been coaching the boy to call him Dad. This is sick. No one moved to help Elliot. They watched. Some filmed. A few nodded quietly, believing what they wanted to believe, too willing to let fear speak louder than facts. A stranger's appearance became a justification. A rainbow pin became a warning. But behind the counter, a woman stepped out. Tina, a store employee in her late 20s, approached with caution, but not fear. Her eyes flicked to Elliot, then to Karen. I've seen him before, she said firmly. He's been in here with the phone several times. He buys books, art kits, puzzles, and they always seem happy. Karen didn't flinch. And you think that proves anything? Anyone can play the part? It's people like this, she pointed at Elliot, that slip through the cracks. He shouldn't be near kids. Elliot tried to speak. I have papers in my bag, guardianship forms, from the child welfare office. But Tina wasn't the one he had to convince. Karen's voice cut in again. He says he's a teacher too. Great. A gay teacher around children. How is that safe? The room tensed. Her words weren't shouted, but they landed like gunfire. Elliot's knees almost gave out, not because of fear, but because he'd heard this before. Quietly, indirectly, but never so naked. Never in a moment where he needed protection, and instead received suspicion. Micah started crying. Not loud, just a something, heartbroken sound that made Elliot ache. The boy clung to Karen's arm out of confusion. Not comfort, his tiny face turning red. I want to go with Dad, he sobbed. But no one looked at him. No one asked why the child was begging to return to the very man being accused of harm. Karen pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police. If you won't protect that child, I will. Tina tried to interject, but Karen waved her off. You're enabling him. What if something happens? Will you take responsibility? I won't stand by and watch a predator walk free. That word pierced through Elliot's chest. Predator. In an instant, his identity, his mourning, his devotion, his quiet evenings helping Micah draw stars on construction paper. All of it disappeared, replaced by a single word rooted in centuries of fear and ignorance. The seconds dragged. A family walked past, whispering. A teenage boy tilted his phone up for a clearer shot. Elliot saw himself reflected in the dark glass of the shop window, pale, shaking, surrounded. Not a teacher, not a grieving husband, not a father, just a stranger in someone else's narrative. No one asked for his name. No one asked for Micah's story. They just saw what they chose to see. And now they were waiting for sirens. Elliot didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He simply knelt, one knee against the cold tile floor, and whispered to Micah, even from a distance, I'm right here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere. But inside, his heart broke. He had protected Micah from loss once. Now he wasn't sure if he could protect him from the world. The shrill wail of sirens cut through the walls before the red and blue lights painted the storefront windows. Customers shifted, stepping back with hushed urgency. Some whispered. Others pressed record. Elliot remained kneeling, arms loose at his sides. His hands shook, not from guilt, but from helplessness. He'd brought documents. He'd followed every rule. And still, he was being treated like a threat. Micah's sobs had quieted into hiccups, his eyes wide and terrified, locked on the man he called Dad. The door burst open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, hands already hovering above their belts. One had his palm resting lightly on the butt of his holstered weapon. The other scanned the room as if expecting chaos. The crowd parted, eyes locked onto Elliot like a spotlight finding its mark. Karen's voice rose before anyone else could speak. "There he is. That's the man. He grabbed that boy, tried to walk off with him, and he's pretending to be his father." Elliot slowly stood, his voice level, deliberate. "My name is Elliot Sanders. I have legal guardianship of Micah. He's my foster son. My husband and I—" "You have ID," one officer interrupted. "Paperwork." Elliot nodded, reaching slowly into his bag. His every movement was watched, measured, as though reaching for a folder might justify escalation. He pulled out the envelope, hands trembling slightly, and handed over certified documents from the Colorado Department of Human Services. His name, Micah's name, temporary custody, a court order, notarized. He followed it with a letter from the adoption agency, a recent school enrollment form, a photograph of him, Micah, and Alex smiling in front of a mural at the elementary school where he taught. Alex's arm rested gently on Elliot's shoulder, Micah grinning between them. A snapshot of family, a memory now weaponized as evidence. Karen crossed her arms. "Anyone can fake papers. This is what happens when people like that are allowed near children. Gay men pretending to be fathers." "Ma'am," one officer said, trying to silence her, but she didn't stop. "You think a rainbow pin and a nice smile make him safe? That child could be in danger. I did what any good person would do." Micah took a step forward, his voice thin but clear. "He's my dad. He takes care of me." Still, the officers looked uncertain. The crowd watched, hungry for resolution. And then a deep voice came from behind them. "That's enough." Deshaun Rivers stepped throughout the entrance with the calm of someone used to commanding a room. His tailored blazer bore the logo of the mall management team. His presence shifted the air. He walked past the officers, past the onlookers, and stopped beside Elliot, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "I know this man, and I knew his husband. Alex, he was my best friend." Deshaun turned to the officers, meeting their eyes without flinching. "I was at Alex's funeral 6 months ago. I've seen Elliot raise this boy with more grace and patience than most two-parent households ever manage. That child isn't being kidnapped. He's being loved." The crowd murmured. A few lowered their phones. Deshaun then turned to Karen. "You know what's dangerous, assuming, acting on fear instead of fact. You saw a man who didn't fit your picture of what a father looks like, and you made him a threat in your mind." Karen's face reddened, her lips parted, but no words came. The officers hesitated. One asked, "Is there security footage?" Deshaun nodded. "We've got full coverage. Every step they took since entering. From the moment they walked in, Elliot's done nothing but hold that child's hand, answer his questions, and pay for his toy. You'll see everything." A pause, then the officer stepped back. His hand left his belt. "We'd like to review the footage before we proceed." Karen opened her mouth again, but this time no one listened. The tide had shifted. Micah ran to Elliot, wrapping his arms around his waist, burying his face in his jacket, and Elliot, for the first time that day, allowed himself to exhale. He had come for a book and a toy. He hadn't expected to fight for the right to be called dad, but he stood taller now, not because he was cleared, but because someone finally looked at him and saw truth. The room darkened slightly as the manager's office lit up with the grainy flicker of security footage. A group had gathered quietly, some police, 2 store employees, Karen and Deshaun, while Elliot sat just outside, one arm wrapped around Micah, his other hand still clutching the folder that had been so quickly dismissed. Inside the monitor's glow, the truth unfolded without a single word spoken. The timestamp began from when Elliot and Micah entered the store. No rush, no hesitation, just a man and a boy, hand in hand. Elliot held the door, waited for Micah to step in first. The camera angle from above caught their faces turned toward each other, sharing something simple, something warm, a quiet joy in just being together. They walked toward the children's section. Elliot crouched, often kneeling to Micah's height, letting the boy explore without pressure. He picked up a book about space, pointed to a rocket, and the boy clapped his hands. At one point, Elliot reached to tie Micah's shoelace, which had come undone as he turned a corner too quickly. He knelt down, gently looping the laces, double knotting them like he'd done 100 times before. A father's instinct, not a stranger's guess. Then came the footage from the register. Elliot handed over his card. Micah stood on tiptoe, placing a plastic dinosaur and a book on the counter. They smiled. The cashier smiled back. The receipt printed. The bag was handed to Micah, who grasped it with both arms like a treasure. Nothing about the video wavered. Not a single frame supported Karen's claims. When the footage ended, the silence in the room was heavier than before, but now it hung in shame from us. The loud officer turned toward Elliot. "Mr. Sanders," he said, stepping out into the hallway. "We've reviewed the footage. We sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Micah, still clinging to Elliot, looked up. "They're not taking me." Elliot kissed the boy's forehead. "No one's taking you, buddy." One of the employees who had stood quietly in the background came forward and offered Micah a small sticker. "For being so brave," she whispered. Karen stepped back into the hallway, her face pale. The force behind her words had vanished. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to justify, but the moment had passed. The same people who had once nodded along with her now avoided her eyes. Some turned away, others muttered under their breath. "I just thought," she began, but the sentence died before it formed. No one wanted to hear what she thought anymore. Two teenage girls who had filmed the scene earlier walked over to Elliot. One of them held up her phone. "I deleted the video. I'm really sorry." "Sir." The other nodded. "So did I. That wasn't right." One by one, the crowd around them began to shift, not with noise, but with a quiet, collective pull toward accountability. What had started as a public shaming had become something else, a reckoning. Tina, the store employee, stepped forward again. "You shouldn't have to prove you're a father," she said softly. "But I'm glad you did. And I'm sorry we didn't all see it sooner." Elliot nodded, holding Micah a little tighter. The officers returned his documents, now reviewed and verified. One offered a business card, should Elliot need to file a report of his own. But Elliot declined. His focus was no longer on punishment. His only concern now was the boy beside him and the silence that might follow him into every future store, every park, every waiting room. As they walked out of the store, hand in hand, Elliot passed Karen without a word. She didn't look up. Deshaun waited near the exit. "You okay, Wasim?" he asked quietly. Elliot nodded once. "Better now." The automatic door slid open, and the Colorado sun spilled in sharp and golden against the polished tile floor. What had been questioned inside was now undeniable. The man they feared was a father, and the only thing he had done was love a child who still needed him. The air outside the mall was warmer than it had been hours before, but Elliot still felt the chill lingering in his chest, the kind of cold that didn't come from the wind, but from being doubted, from being seen and still unseen, from being told, without words, that love needed approval. Micah walked beside him now, tightly holding his hand, the small paper bag swinging at his side. Inside it was a toy dinosaur, a space book, and a receipt that somehow carried more weight than it should. Every few steps, Micah looked up to make sure Elliot was still there, and Elliot always was. They didn't speak for a while. Words weren't necessary between them anymore. They had both felt it, that invisible line between safety and fear, between truth and assumption. They had crossed it together. Inside the mall's courtyard, a small crowd had gathered near a makeshift podium. Deshaun Rivers stood beneath a banner bearing the mall's name, his calm voice amplified just enough to reach the crowd, but still grounded. Personal. Elliot paused on the steps leading down into the courtyard, not expecting to be mentioned. But Deshaun looked up, spotted him, and gave a short nod before turning back to the microphone. Today, he began. We witnessed something uncomfortable but necessary. We saw what happens when fear overrides facts, when someone's identity becomes more important than their humanity. He took a breath. But we also saw something else. We saw a child speak truth when adults chose silence. We saw a father stand steady, even as others tried to rip that title from him. And we saw the power of community when it chooses to see, rather than assume. People listened. Some stood with arms crossed. Others leaned in. A few lowered their phones. Deshaun continued, his voice unwavering. It's not enough to fight racism or homophobia in private conversations. We must protect the families that don't always look the way we expect. We must stand up for the children who find love in homes society still questions. Because love, at its core, does not require permission to exist. There was quiet applause, not loud, but sincere. Karen Whitaker was not in the crowd. Word had already spread that her mall membership had been revoked, and the video had circulated widely, drawing condemnation from parents, teachers, and advocacy groups alike. She had become a cautionary tale. But Elliot didn't linger on that. He didn't need revenge. He had something better. After the speech, Deshaun joined them by the fountain. He didn't say much, just placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder once more, then bent down to Micah's level. You have a very good dad, he said. Micah nodded solemnly. I know. That night, Elliot returned home, placing Micah's drawing on the fridge with a new magnet one, shaped like a tiny planet. Micah had drawn their family himself. Elliot, and a third figure outlined in soft pencil, Alex, floating just above them in the sky, smiling. The next morning, Elliot returned to his classroom. He opened the blinds, arranged the art supplies, and waited for his students with Micah sitting quietly beside him, flipping through his new book. No one asked where Micah came from. No one needed to, because when the bell rang and children filled the room with life, Elliot stood tall, not hiding, not apologizing, just a teacher, just a father, just a man who refused to let strangers define what his family meant. He had nothing to prove anymore. Not after that day, because family doesn't need an audience. It only needs truth. What would you have done if you saw someone falsely accused like Elliot? Would you speak up or stay silent? Let us know in the comments. And if stories like this speak to your heart, subscribe to Heart Story for more powerful, emotional narratives that remind us all love doesn't need permission.